Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to Bloomberg Businessweek with Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
Well, Emily, typically investing for retirement goes like this. When you're young and you have many years to work, you primarily own volatile assets, like stocks. Only a small portion of your portfolio is bonds. Then as you get older, your portfolio grows, that allocation changes. And when you get close to retirement, a lot more of your portfolio is bonds than it's stocks. That's the conventional wisdom, but our next guest says that's not enough for today. Sal Capizzi is Executive Vice President at Dunham Associates Investment Counsel. He joins us here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. We talk a lot about the idea of conventional wisdom for retirement being broken, but what specifically do you see not working today and why?
Well, it's what we call the retirement investment paradox, right? And it's exactly what you just described. So when I came into this business, our asset allocation was basically what they called an age-based allocation. Here's how it worked. If I was 20 years old, I had a client 20 years old, that means I put them 20% in bonds, 80% in stocks.
That sounds too simple.
As they got older, right. Yeah, so they're 30 years old, now they have 30% in bonds. By the time they hit age 65, they would be 65% in bonds, 35% in stocks, and that worked for us because there was one risk that we were trying to mitigate, and that was sequence risk. What we didn't want was for them to hit retirement in a bad market and suddenly find that their entire retirement portfolio basically was blown apart. So that's all we were concerned about, because at age 65 back then, we knew they had maybe 10 to 20 years left in retirement. Today,
meaning
it's
10
different.
to 20 years before they died.
Correct, before they passed away.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing today is a little bit different, because what we're seeing today is there are three major risks. There's inflation, there's the fact that we're living longer, and there's sequence risk. And a financial advisor now has to balance those type of those risks. Back in the late 90s, there was a major Boston asset management company by the Great Big Dig, for your new listeners out in Boston. And they had a big billboard. As you were sitting through traffic, you're watching this billboard. And what it said was that the first person to live to be 150 years old is alive today. It is not uncommon right now where we know that there are people that are over 100 years old. I know 3 different people that are now over 100 years old.
My grandma turns 102 next month, and I just visited her over the weekend.
And she's doing fine, right?
I mean, she's 102.
Yeah.
She still definitely has some of her snappiness.
Does she own crypto and leverage NVIDIA?
No. None of that going on.
So where do you focus now? Is this a change because of this paradox? Is this a change that like young people are adding more risk assets, or you're focusing more on that 65 and up age group and changing that portfolio allocation?
It's the 65 on up, because that's where we have the paradox. Because if we're living longer, right, what you need in your portfolio is growth, right? Mm-hmm. Stocks tend to give us growth. If you're trying to battle inflation, right, and even if the Fed hits its 2% target, the compounding effect of 2% inflation for someone who's 102 years old, right? What it basically means is that if I retired, right, I'm 65 and I go to the supermarket and there are 25 items that I purchase, right? And I purchase those same items. So it's bread, it's milk, it's vegetables, it's fruit. I purchase the same items every single week. At a 2% inflation, by the time 40 years later, right, I have to take 13 of those items out of my basket and leave them at the supermarket, leaving with just 11 or spending a lot more, right? And so the paradox is, what is the asset class that is best to handle inflation? Well, it's equities, right? It's done a great job over the years of combating inflation. But what is the one thing, if you take a look at sequence risk, right? And this is the paradox. What causes sequence risk?
It's if you live too long.
Equities.
And if you are in a portfolio where there's a lot of volatility, your portfolio can go down for a number of years and you don't have that money.
Correct. So if you're trying to combat sequence risk, what do? Then you look at less volatile. You do bonds, you do annuities, you might do bucket strategies, right? But if it's too conservative, now you don't have the growth to combat the inflation and living longer. That's the paradox that we're facing.
So what's the answer here? And also, just, are we doing it wrong with these target date funds? Because a lot of times, we don't have many options when it comes to investing in retirement, for retirement, when you have a 401k with a company, for example. Throw it into target date fund. These things are made catered for a certain age, right?
And the question we have to ask ourselves, and we ask ourselves this question at Dunham, are those the right investments going forward? So if we are going to be living longer, right, then is that the right strategy? Do we really want to be in bonds at the end, or do we as an industry have a responsibility to find new type of investments, new type of overlays that we might be able to have that can combat sequence risk and perhaps give growth?
What are some of the options that are out there?
So at Dunham, we have an option. So this is something that we've been working on, right? This is something that we've been working on for a number of years now in terms of retirees and this concept that we need to be thinking differently. So we have a strategy where basically we're buying fear and selling greed, right? So it's inspired by Warren Buffett, right? The famous quote, be fearful when others are greedy, be greedy when others are fearful, right? So what we're basically doing is we're taking a look at the price of equities, right? As prices go higher and as investors are willing to pay more, we, based on an algorithm, it's math, right? It's math and time, right? As they're willing to pay more, we are selling them the equities. When the market starts to turn, and I should stop hitting that microphone, I guess. So when the markets turn, right, then people start panicking and they're selling equities at lower prices, then we're buying. But here's the key. What that means is this. That means at the top of the market, you own less equities. At the bottom of the market, you have more equities. So what you're attempting to do, what you potentially could accomplish, is mitigating that sequence risk, but at the same time, you now have the growth.
But timing the market, we're told, is a fool's errand. How do you do it?
So we're not timing the market. We're simply looking at the price of the market. We're not trying to pick the top. We're not trying to pick the bottom.
But you're preparing a portfolio to react to situations that include the top and the bottom.
Yes, so a little bit different, right? So number one, it's an overlay. So we have our asset allocation program. Dunham's been doing this for almost 40 years, right? So this is simply an overlay that we place over our regular portfolios that we manage specifically for retirees, just to help them within this sequence risk and this growth that they need. So we're not trying to predict anything. It's simply math, right? So hypothetically, right, this is not how it works, but you could say every time the market moves 5% higher, we're going to sell, right, because we can get a better price. Every time the market dips, right, and it dips by 5%, we'll purchase equities, right? It's a little more complicated than that, the overall algorithm, but it's not much more complicated. We're not using AI. We're not taking 42 different factors into account. It's simply math.
We only have about a minute left, but in your opinion, what's the best place to get income from? Because that's been such a hot theme in the last few years, and I know that retirees like to have an income stream.
So equities provide in certain markets, a tremendous amount of income through their dividends. But clearly right now, bonds are a place to receive income, right? The problem is that is going to start vanishing in a couple of weeks. As the Fed starts lowering rates, we're going to be back to that market again. And that's why at Dunham, what we do is we take a look at retirement and we try to create for our financial advisors that we work with, we try to create a process for them to be able to accomplish the income that the client needs, but also to be able to work hand in hand to get that growth. And we do that through this algorithm.
Very interesting stuff. Sal, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Sal Capizzi, Executive Vice President at Dunham Associates Investment Counsel, joining us here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. When we talk about fertility, IVF, IUI, it's a really hot button issue in politics right now, but and people have different views on how they look at it, and a lot of people in different parts of the country have different views on it, but you can't argue with the way things are going and the stats out there. According to the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, the number of babies born from IVF increased in 2022 to 91,771. That's up from 89,208 in 2021. In other words, according to the ASRM, 2.5% of all births in the U.S. that year were the result of successful assisted reproductive technology cycles. Somebody who watches this closely is Shelly MacConnell, Chief Strategy Officer at Win Fertility. It's a company that works on family building. They work on IVF, IUI, and they provide support around those things. And full disclosure, I believe it is a company that Bloomberg uses in its benefits. Shelly joins us from Greenwich, Connecticut. Shelly, good to have you with us. How are you?
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. It's interesting to see these numbers because I'll be honest with you, 91,000 births from IVF or IUI, that seems low. I think if you live in a city and you're of a certain age, a lot of people you know have gone through IVF or IUI or other assisted fertility. I'm wondering from your perspective, why you think it's grown so much in such a short time. Is it because we're all having kids when we're older now?
That's one of the factors, but it's not all of the factors. In fact, when it comes to infertility and pregnancy loss, historically, women have held the stigma and the burden, the financial burden, the mental burden, the physical burden of treatments and testing and monitoring. But what we know now is that male reproductive health contributes to infertility as much as female reproductive health. So, for men and women, fertility does decrease as we age. But that is not the only factor. There are a lot of environmental factors and undetermined factors as well.
What is Win doing when it comes to these male fertility treatments? Because I agree with you. You don't really hear that much about the treatments that men can undergo for infertility.
Right. Yes. It's very important for men early and comprehensively to be tested. Anything that can interrupt their hormone levels can impact their fertility. So in some cases, there are actual procedures to help. In other cases, there are medical interventions. And in some cases, there are drug protocols that can help.
It's so interesting when you hear about the idea of reproductive techniques, you hear a lot about egg freezing. What I have not heard about is sperm freezing. And I know, thanks to our producer, Paul Brennan, who sent us some notes ahead of time, that about a third of your clients are offering elective sperm freezing services.
That's right.
Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, we're actually seeing this increase in popularity from a few perspectives. One is some acknowledgement that male reproductive health and fertility does decrease over time. And so having sperm preserved is something that's becoming a little more popular, although not nearly as it's not experiencing nearly the boom that egg freezing has been experiencing. The second is that often when someone is about to undergo a medical treatment that would negatively and significantly compromise their fertility, they choose to preserve sperm for future use. An example would be certain cancer treatments where they will likely be rendered infertile as a result. They may preserve it for future use. And then the third would be anyone who would be going through gender reassignment should be offered the opportunity to preserve egg or sperm prior to undergoing hormone treatment.
So the sperm freezing, is that cheaper than egg freezing?
Yes, it is much cheaper than egg freezing. Egg freezing might be $10,000 to $15,000. That can depend on where you are geographically and how successful the cycles are. For men, all in, it is maybe $700 to $1,000.
What do we know so far about the success rate in that kind of procedure? Because with egg freezing, it doesn't always work.
No, that's true. And for men, collection of sperm is much more straightforward and much easier. And so that tends to be more successful. What we would have concerns about, it's not just the quantity, but the quality of the sperm. And so we know that in male infertility, both the quantity and quality of the sperm are impacting fertility. And so making sure that the quality of the sperm is very good and has minimal DNA fragmentation and other things that can negatively impact fertility and pregnancy loss.
I'm wondering about, Shelly, the idea of low testosterone and how, from your position at Win Fertility, you're looking at this phenomenon that we're seeing.
Yes, significant. Male testosterone levels typically drop off annually from age 30 and above, and can do so quite significantly from the age 50 and up. About 25% of men report adverse symptoms associated with the decrease in testosterone and what is called andropause. And very many report that it impacts their work and their ability to perform their work functions. So it actually is something that has not been well publicized or discussed to the extent that it should be, but has a significant impact on male health.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It is Bloomberg Businessweek. Let's get back to our conversation with Shelly MacConnell, Chief Strategy Officer at Win Fertility, joining us from Connecticut. Shelly, Emily and I were talking, and you mentioned something in our previous conversation that really piqued our interest.
Yeah, so you had said that there were certain environmental factors that impact male infertility. Go into some detail on that. Name a couple of those factors and what people should be watching out for.
Well, there are certainly kind of the age-old things that we know about, particularly around temperature and keeping cool. So some of these things like boxer shorts are preferred over briefs. But men who exercise excessively, which some do, can sometimes elevate temperature and have a negative impact on sperm. But there are also environmental factors like microplastics that are believed to have an impact. Anything that could disrupt hormones will impact sperm production. Again, quality and quantity. So things like the rise in insulin resistance in our population, as you can see in prediabetes and diabetes going up so much, particularly in our younger generations, that can have an impact on fertility. Any endocrine disrupting chemicals in the environment can also do so. Microplastics are everywhere.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. It's so interesting to hear you talk about this, because this is not something. This is a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, we used to, like microplastics. There used to be soaps, I think, that had microplastics in them, just so they'd have like abrasive qualities, and those that would obviously get into the to the sewer system is like pretty terrible stuff in hindsight, in retrospect.
Yes.
What should people be
Yes.
doing to
Well, it's interesting
mitigate some
to
of these
add to
risks?
what
Because
you-
this stuff is everywhere.
This stuff is everywhere. And I was reading recently about a study where they were trying to assess the impact of microplastics on male reproductive organs. And they couldn't establish a control group. They could not establish a group that did not have the presence of microplastics. So I think there is some about being careful of your environment, but there are things that we all can control more around healthy diets, healthy living, stress, maintaining, reducing sugar to not impact your insulin levels, and so forth. Those are things that you can control. And we would suggest, as I mentioned, that if you're going through this process, for all men to be tested early and comprehensively, so that they could potentially be treated. Another factor is that people don't always have access to urologists. 60% of counties in the US have no urologists, and more than 90% of urologists are practicing in metropolitan
Did you say
areas.
what percent of counties
60%
60 counties in the U.S. don't have urologists?
of counties.
60%? Oh my God.
Yes.
That's
So
wild.
sometimes virtual care is very important. They're very concentrated in the metropolitan areas. Tim, that maybe goes a little bit to what you were mentioning at the beginning. But having access to virtual care can be very important for people to be able to access urology and urologists.
Are fertility benefits seen as baseline these days?
Yes, very much so. It's an expectation of employees, and for the most part, employers have agreed, although the figures can vary, but somewhere between 40 and above 50% of employers offer fertility benefits in some capacity. And I expect that will be much higher in the very near future. It's a business imperative. It's an expectation from an employee recruiting and retention standpoint.
Hey, I mentioned politics at the top of our interview. There was there was a February 16th decision that meant anyone who destroyed embryos could be liable for wrongful death. And this is in Alabama. They passed a law to protect IVF treatments after this embryo ruling. How do you watch what's happening politically now in your industry?
Well, we watch it very closely. It's impossible to predict what is going to happen. In a lot of places, we are short on details as to what is being proposed and what may occur. Nonetheless, the elevated visibility of this topic across both parties and both campaigns points to the fact that this is so important for people to have access to these treatments. We continue to watch, and we would suggest that businesses offer comprehensive benefits that include independent clinical guidance for people. This is a very complex clinical experience, but it also is a complex legislative environment. And understanding and having someone who can help guide you through this process is what is helping so many people through and to the other end of success.
Shelly, thanks so much for joining us on Bloomberg Businessweek. Shelly MacConnell is Chief Strategy Officer at Win Fertility. They do family building and family well-being benefits for companies, including full disclosure here at Bloomberg.